immersed in the master's program, I've gotten very good at explaining this topic to other fellow ethnomusicologists and musicians. But I think this is a really great opportunity to also just kind of talk with people who maybe, aren't hearing about this from me on a constant basis, and to kind of summarize the topic in a very short, amount of time. 12 minutes is, not a super long presentation. So I'll try not to make it rushed, and I'll try to be as concise as possible while also providing the necessary background information so that you can understand why this topic is even something I would choose to research, and also what the contributions of my thesis were. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and I have a couple short music clips. When we tried the audio just now, some people were able to hear it and some weren't. Hopefully everyone will be able to hear the audio, but it's not a massive part of the presentation. So I hope that even if you aren't able to hear, I apologize in advance, but I hope it will still be informative and interesting. Okay, so I'm going to just read a very short excerpt from the very beginning of the thesis. I'm going to kind of bookend my speaking with two very just little short written excerpts. In 1998, the Japanese Ministry of Education made an important change to its national education policy to require the teaching of pre-modern Japanese music in K-12 music classes. This pre-modern Japanese music, which I refer to as Hōgaku in this thesis, was not part of the country's music education system in any significant capacity prior to that point. Instead, the Japanese music education system was based almost entirely on European and American music education systems throughout the 20th century. Since the 1998 policy change requiring teaching of pre-modern Japanese genres, long ignored traditional instruments have been going an intriguing reimagining and reconfiguration. My thesis research examines how a subset of scholars and music teachers are making significant efforts to incorporate this pre-modern music into the K-12 music curriculum. This process is the result of a complex, multifaceted intellectual and political discourse, one with roots in 20th century modernity and Japanese academic practice. So this is the one sentence policy change. You guys can see this, right? Can you see the, okay, perfect. So the amount of stress and anguish that this one sentence made for music teachers in Japan can only really be understood in the context of Japanese music education history. To succinctly summarize as best as I can, there's quite a lot of research covering this topic. Essentially, when Japan aggressively westernized in the late 19th century, they, under threat of colonization from European colonial powers, music was a very important part of the new public school education system that they instituted in the country. And the major focus was on teaching Japanese citizens how to understand European and American forms of music, which were very, very different from the widely established Japanese genres that were popular at the time. So after more than a century of essentially excluding traditional Japanese music from the public school curriculum, why did the government decide to make the change in 1998 to suddenly make traditional music a much more important part of the music classroom? So ethnomusicologist Henry Johnson, who there is a mistake here in the citation, his first and last name have been flipped, sorry about that. So Henry Johnson connects this to broader nationalistic trends that were happening at the time. Throughout the 90s, Japan went through a period of severe economic decline, following the post-war decades in which Japan had experienced immense economic success, export-based production of electronics, cars. In the late 90s, a lot of dialogue began happening about how to reimagine Japan's place in a globalized world following this severe economic decline. And a significant part of this discourse was the idea of reestablishing Japanese national identity. So as far as the motivations for actually enacting this government policy, I I largely agree with Johnson that there were significant nationalistic motivations for the policymakers and those who were involved sort of at the top in government positions, especially based on other trends in other areas of Japanese education, such as history textbooks and literature. But what my research is most interested in is what's happening on the ground with the music teachers themselves. So for decades before this, both music teachers who had been trained as music teachers without any particular specialization in Japanese music and performers of Japanese instruments had been advocating for Japanese traditional music to become a more important part of K through 12 music education. So when this policy change actually happened, regardless of the government's motivations for instituting such a policy change, the actual practice of what's happening in classrooms is much more complex and I think interesting to explore. So that's really the major focus of my research is how have practitioners of Japanese instruments, but also K through 12 music teachers who were not trained in them but want to make them a more important part of their classroom, worked to establish these new pedagogical techniques and ideas. So in my thesis, I use the topic of coolness as a kind of important theoretical lens. This is an idea that seems sort of maybe flippant at first glance, but it's actually a very important concept in a lot of Japanese media and politics. So in the thesis, I talk about how anxiety about whether the koto is cool or not actually is kind of at odds with incorporating the koto's historical music canon into music classes. So while the koto is often perceived as being valuable as part of music education for its historical roots, the actual music itself is, without proper contextualization, very difficult for both foreign audiences, but also even domestic Japanese students to understand. So in order to kind of demonstrate the stylistic disparity between these, the genres of the kind of core canon of music that's used in K through 12 music classes in Japan, as opposed to this new type of traditional type of music that music teachers are newly being asked to teach. I have a couple of videos, just very short. So this is an example of a shoka. This is a type of short song that was created in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, specifically for the purpose of instructing Japanese students in this new Euro-American form of music, harmony, melody, singing. And I think anybody who's gone to preschool or elementary school in Japan will know this song. By comparison, I'd like to just give you an example of a koto performance. So this is, sorry, this says 18th century, but this is an early 19th century piece by Kikuoka Kengyo and Yaezaki Kengyo. And this is an example of Jiuta Sokyoku. So the traditional canon of koto music included text and vocal melodies as a very, very significant part of these pieces. So this is the end of the instrumental interlude between the opening section and the closing section. So this is leading into the closing song.
I'm sorry, Garrett, we're not hearing it.
Uh, is everybody unable to hear that?
It's funny. I can hear it for some reason. But Garrett, I wonder if maybe since some people can't, if it would be better to just not share computer sound and
Yeah, okay.
the audio won't be great, but we'll be able to get a sense of it just hearing it through your speakers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, let me try that. So hopefully this will give you at least a rough idea. So that's just a very short excerpt to kind of give you an idea of what this music sounds like. So, if you're an ethnomusicologist, it's probably not particularly surprising to you that traditional Japanese music is a very small part of music teacher training. But if you're like me, or like most people, this information is probably very surprising to you. So one of the major things that my research pointed toward is the gap between the implementation of this government policy, which focused on K through 12 music teachers, but didn't really substantially change the way that music colleges and other tertiary educational institutions are actually training music teachers. So essentially, the government has implemented a policy requiring the teaching of traditional Japanese instruments, but it wasn't accompanied by significant funding or by significant policy aimed at tertiary education institutions to help facilitate that change and make it easier. And I love this photo because I think it perfectly kind of encapsulates the very marginal position of traditional Japanese instruments in Japanese music colleges. And this is especially stark when compared to other fields such as the visual arts, where Japanese ceramics, calligraphy, ink painting, other types of traditional Japanese visual arts retain a much more significant place of prestige. Of course, one of the reasons for this is that I believe that a lot of visual arts are just aesthetically much more approachable, whereas music is fixed in time, it's bounded, and it's commonly assumed to be a universal language and something that people can appreciate without contextualization, whereas in fact, traditional Japanese music is very difficult to understand without background information. So as a response to this, a lot of scholars and music educators have been developing different works that seek to kind of bridge this gap between the government requirement and the lack of training that's happening in tertiary educational institutions. So this has been a growing body of literature, particularly since even in the 1970s, 80s, there were some of these works. Yoshio Chihara was an important author who was working on really bringing this new form of music education incorporating traditional Japanese music to the public eye, but a larger and larger number of scholars have been publishing works aimed at K through 12 music teachers who are tasked with this requirement but have a lot of difficulty actually implementing it in practice. So I looked at some of the shared trends that are happening and some of the ideas and the ways that music teachers are making traditional Japanese music interesting, compelling, contextualizable for K through 12 music teachers. So this included interviewing the authors of many of these books. It also included observation of a koto workshop over Zoom, which was quite an interesting experience in fall of 2020, which provided a lot of great information. And I did continue to see this kind of palpable anxiety about the coolness of the koto. So one point that often comes up when the koto is being introduced in these contexts is that as a way of kind of making it more cool for students, music teachers will point to the fact that different parts of the koto are named after a dragon. So the head of the dragon and the tail of the dragon are actual words in Japanese to use to refer to different parts of the instrument. This was something I had already known previously from my own experience as a koto player, but it's interesting to see the ways in which music teachers seek to make this very old-fashioned instrument kind of seem cool, accessible, and interesting to contemporary students. One other really important trend that I saw was the use of mnemonic syllables. So a lot of Japanese traditional musics were traditionally transmitted by blind musicians, and as a way of memorizing pieces, mnemonic syllables to describe different performance techniques were used. This is shared across a lot of different genres of traditional Japanese music, and so it's become a really important point of focus for scholars working nowadays. But the really interesting thing is that there's an increased focus on the use of the voice by looking at these mnemonic syllables, and yet the actual function that the voice has had in traditional Japanese music in singing vocal melodies has really not been a significant part of this classroom education, which is very interesting. Instead, the actual music that's being played tends to focus on pieces such as Sakura Sakura. And one of the great points of my research that I discovered is that I had always kind of wondered why Sakura Sakura was so prominent in koto workshops. So I explored some great research in Japanese that looks at the fact that Sakura Sakura may have actually just been written the Sakura Sakura is typically described as being an old Japanese folk song. In fact, it may have been written in 1888 as part of the westernization efforts of the Committee for Research in Music. So stylistically, I knew that Sakura Sakura had been arranged in a kind of Euro-American musical idiom, but I had never known, and I don't think it is widely known among most people in Japan, that it may have actually been composed in the late 19th century as an explicitly westernizing piece. And actually, Sakura Sakura was not, according to this author Shimada Yumi's research, was not really widely performed by a lot of people in Japan until the immediate pre-World War II years. And that was actually due to a sort of throwback mentality that there was sort of a developing sense that Japan had gotten so far away from its own traditional music. At least Sakura Sakura had a sort of veneer of sounding traditionally Japanese. So you can see some really interesting, ways that this music is used in these classroom situations. One other really interesting thing, so going back to the first picture that I had at the very beginning, because of time and budget constraints, one technique that I've seen very commonly used in classrooms is to have two students perform on one koto. So this is not universal, but it's extremely common in koto workshops, and it diverges significantly from the way that the koto is typically performed, which you can see in the right-hand photo. One player will use both their left and right hand. The right hand plucks the strings, and the left hand increases or decreases tension in order to change pitch. Then in the left-hand photo, you can see two students where one student takes the role of the right hand and the other student takes the role of the left hand. So this is something that was initially introduced because of budgetary concerns, but it's become more and more widespread, and it almost points to a kind of new koto performance style that exists in classrooms today. So one of the major conclusions is that a lot of teachers who've been trained essentially in a purely European and American music education model, it's only natural that they would kind of approach traditional Japanese instruments in a sort of auto-orientalized way. Not orientalized maybe, but still kind of using the same music that's been popular in Japanese classrooms throughout the 20th century in their introduction of Japanese traditional instruments as well. And so the key word in the Japanese government policy that introduces this traditional Japanese music does not focus on the canon of music itself, but actually on the physical instruments. So this kind of leads us to the question, if you're performing what is essentially Western music on a Japanese instrument, to what extent have the students really learned about what pre-modern Japanese music actually sounded like? And as an alternative, I would love to provide this one example. So in some countries like India, the violin has actually come to commonly be used for performance of pre-modern music. And this is also something that completely would be possible in Japan as well. So this is an example of what that might look like. Of course, I would love to play the whole piece for you, but I have used pretty much my whole 20 minutes just talking about my thesis. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope that was a good balance between providing the necessary background info, but also kind of talking about the sort of new directions that research points toward.
And I think we can take about, we can push a little bit, take about 3 minutes for questions if people have questions they want to ask. Well, let's see. Anne Prescott is raising her hand. Anne, do you want to ask your question?
Sure.
I know whatever question this is will be great.
No, thank you so much. It's really interesting. I haven't looked at these questions for 20 years or so. I just had a question about your definition of pre-modern music and what they teach in the schools. So I have right here, I don't have my camera on, but a textbook from several years ago, but it does include Miyagi. How far have you found that they've gone with that definition? Do they stick with pre-20th century or do they go into the 20th century, and how far?
So, well, for somebody who would, so I find that the music that tends to be included in these textbooks is almost entirely either from 1888 onwards, so Sakura Sakura, and likely Miyagi pieces such as Harunomi or Tegoto, but the students are probably not actually performing Harunomi or Tegoto or any Miyagi pieces, they're just hearing them performed by the instructor or on a CD. So as far as the pieces of music that students are actually playing, it's usually either rokudan, the first dan of rokudan played solo without accompaniment, or Sakura Sakura. And I didn't find any examples of other pieces than those two, except for free improvisation or like melodies that they already know from their music classroom, like Shōgaku Shoka.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, thank you. And I would definitely love to talk with you more about this because I would love to get your feedback. So,
I see that Jay has a question.
Garrett, I enjoyed a very nice presentation in this short amount of time. How would you factor in 16th, 17th, and 18th century colonialism and the psychological part of Euro supremacy in defining the traditional cultural limitations here in this society? Because I think that this concept is applicable in many parts of planet Earth.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an aspect of it that has implications for a lot of other countries. So there's a fantastic book that a Japanese scholar called Yuko Chiba wrote called "The Japanese People Chose Do-Re-Mi." So her assertion is kind of, she's talking about how the Japanese public did kind of ultimately end up choosing the more Western, Eurocentric version of music that the government pioneered in the late, kind of, I don't want to say that everybody in Japan resisted it when it was first introduced, but there was a lot of resistance to these new musical styles when they were introduced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the Japanese listening public did kind of in the end settle on, okay, we want to listen to this type of music, but it's also a decision that was made under duress and under the threat of colonization. And so that's why I believe that pre-19th century music is valuable for its historical reasons, but also as a way of showing, the audiences at the time. I think there's a universalizing tendency when we talk about classical music that everybody should like it, everybody does like it. It's a sort of natural form of music that's supposed to be accessible to everyone. Of course, obviously, ethnomusicologists and composers are very aware that this is a much more complicated position than it appears to be. So I think that introducing the pre-modern Japanese music is very helpful in showing that the transition to the way that the current music system was not inevitable and was made under a lot of government pressure, which also makes it more ironic that now the government is kind of making these gestures to go back and try to sort of make things back the way they were. But now, at this point, it's really hard to do that without significant additional funding. They can't just sort of say, we're Japanese, so we should study Japanese music. There has to actually be a lot more training and financial support to make that decision more than just kind of lip service, basically.
I'd like to, at some point before you, in your next step, talk with you about that, because I don't necessarily buy that as a post-colonialist thinker and as the psychological modeling of Euro supremacy in the last 400 years. I think that many of these things were engineered, but I do appreciate your point of view on that, and I don't want to take up any more time.
Okay, in the interest of time, we're gonna give one last question to Saida, who had her hand raised also, and then we'll have to move on to the next presentation.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, congratulations on your fascinating research, Garrett. I'm really pleased to see how it all came together. And wonderful presentation as well. I have a question about the reception end of this new pedagogical system when it was introduced in Japan. Have you had a chance to conduct interviews among K-12 students to get a sense of how taking these classes in Japanese traditional music may have influenced their own learning paths later on? Because there are many ways in which we can be introduced to a music, or a musical instruments, but then even if it's introduced in a way radically different from the way the instrument would be taught in traditional contexts, it may inspire us to go on and explore this musical tradition in depth, and actually lead us to becoming professional musicians and so on. And I'm sure you also have a similar learning trajectory in Japanese music. Yeah, so that's my question.
Yes, that's a great question, and that's really the aspect of the research that I wish I could have done field work in Japan, because I think that would have been the area that would have most benefited from being able to physically be in the classroom and to talk with both the music teachers and the students who are participating in these attempts to bring the koto into the current K through 12 music classroom situation. So that's definitely an area that I want to keep exploring in the future, because you're right. It's this has become, because of the government policy change, this has become the K through 12 music education has become the subject of a lot of scholarship in Japanese about traditional music, but that's certainly not the only pathway. And Japanese traditional music is thriving in certain contexts outside of the school system. So once I'm able to go back to Japan again, this is definitely something that I want to really take an in-depth look at and talk to a lot more people.
Thanks, Garrett. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks, everyone, for your questions.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, next up is I'm going to be presenting on my thesis research. I will try to keep myself honest, but also, if I don't know if Devanney or someone also wants to kind of if keep an eye on things also in case I lose track of the time. But I'll try my best not to. I'm Stuart Wheeler. I just finished up. Well, I don't know. I'm in the process of finishing up the whatever. It's kind of done. The MA. I've been on the music composition track here at Wesleyan, and my thesis research. The title of my thesis is "Making Music by Reading Out Loud," and it's particularly the research is particularly focused on a small body of work from John Cage that he started making particularly in the early 1970s, which is focused on using language and reading to make musical composition. In the thesis, I relate a lot of this work also to the work of his friend, the performance poet Jackson Mac Low, who was really influenced by Cage, and then Cage ended up being really influenced by him. And there's an interesting network of kind of like friendship and mutual influence there that I don't have any time to get into today. So, what I want to start off by talking about is just, first of all, like why Cage was interested in making music in this particular kind of way, what his motivations and concerns were at the time. And I want to read a quote from him from the preface to his book M, which was published by Wesleyan University Press in 1972, or 73, actually, I think. This is a statement that Cage has about syntax in language. He says, "Syntax, according to Norman O. Brown, is the arrangement of the army. As we move away from it, we demilitarize language. This demilitarization of language is conducted in many ways. A single language is pulverized. The boundaries between two or more languages are crossed. Elements not strictly linguistic, such as graphic or musical, are introduced, etc. Translation becomes, if not impossible, unnecessary. nonsense and silence are produced, familiar to lovers. We begin to actually live together, and the thought of separating doesn't enter our minds. So Cage's idea here is based off of his understanding and concerns with the world situation, particularly in relation to the United States and their military presence. And his idea is that language plays a role in this, and this idea of syntax and language, and that something that he feels that he can meaningfully contribute to the situation is to begin to do work in relation to music that opens language up into other kinds of things that it can do besides giving orders, basically, this militarization of language that he sees as being facilitated through syntax. So the way in which he goes about attempting to do this is by, there's a couple of different ways, but the way that I'm going to focus on is a particular technique of fragmentation that he used, specifically in relation to a source text. So Cage's first major piece of music in this style is titled Mureau, M-U-R-E-A-U, which is sort of, it's taken from music and Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, the American naturalist. What he did was take Thoreau's journals, the journals of Thoreau. He used an index to the journals and found every reference to music, sound, or silence, and used those references in the journals as his source material. And then by using and then he took that source material and using chance procedures, fragmented that language and rearranged it onto the page. And he had this particular theoretical framework for linguistic material where he divided it up into sentences, phrases, words, syllables, and letters. These were the 5 different kinds of types of linguistic material that you could organize it into in the way he was thinking about it. And so using chance procedures, he would take different sizes of linguistic fragments from different places in the journals relating to music, sound, or silence, and then rearrange them. And I want to show a little bit of what that looked like on the page for Mureau. I'm going to share screen. Oh, wait, hold on. I'm not going to share screen yet. Here it is. Okay. So here is one of the pages of Mureau, what it ends up looking like, the score. And with Mureau, actually, Cage originally wrote it not as a piece of music, but a piece of literature. It was an article that he wrote, or I mean, sort of an article, right? That he wrote on commission from a magazine. And then after he wrote it, he started experimenting with reading it out loud, and found that that both he and at least some of the audience really enjoyed the experience. And from this, he got the idea to do more with this and more explicitly in the context of music. And so this led him to a couple of years later write a massive work called Empty Words, which was the main focus of my thesis. And Empty Words is divided up into 4 separate lectures, what he called lectures. Each of them is 2.5 hours long to do the entire thing. And so to do the full performance, you do it overnight, and it's timed so that the 4th lecture begins at dawn, and with half-hour intermissions in between each one. Cage only did the full performance 2 times, once in 1979 in Bonn, Germany, and then the second time was in 1981 in Hartford, Connecticut, just up the road from us here in Middletown. But he did perform he performed sections of Empty Words from the time that he wrote it in 74 until the end of his life in 92 when he died. He was performing regularly from Empty Words. It became a really significant piece for him, that and Mureau, in terms of it also marks a point at which Cage was transitioning towards becoming much more interested in performing with his voice outside of giving giving speaking lectures, but becoming more interested in what he was calling singing and improvisation, which was a kind of major turn for him that I think comes basically right out of Miro, and the sort of like excitement that he got from that experiment with reading it out loud. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time left. Let's see. One thing I should say, Empty Words uses the same source material as Miro, except that rather than restricting it to references to sound, silence, and music, this time Cage used the entire journals of Thoreau, which include over 2 million words. So whereas with Miro, he was kind of interested in the way that Thoreau talked about listening. With Empty Words, his concern was more about language in general, in terms of the context, or the quote about syntax, and his desire to break that up. There's a loud lawnmower outside my house right now, and I hope everyone can still hear me okay. I don't know how that's coming through. Okay, great. Okay, so oh yes, I wanted to read also a quote from Cage about his decision to make the particular long overnight performance for Empty Words. He was talking in the late 70s. He talked about this a bit in an interview with Richard Kostelanetz. He said that he had decided on the particular length of 2.5 hours for each of the 4 sections. He said that he decided on that length because he wanted to make it a length that some people would consider excessive. That's his explanation for that. And he explains a little bit further about a couple of experiences that he had that this idea comes out of for him. First was both of the experiences are ones that he said that he had in Japan in 1964 while traveling with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company. The first was a very long Buddhist evening service in Nagoya, to which he and others from the company had been invited. They were warned that it would be very long and that once it started, they would not be allowed to leave. In addition to the length, it was cold and uncomfortable to sit. Cage estimated in the interview recounting this, he estimated that it went on for somewhere around 6 hours and that they all suffered through it, as he said. The second experience he referenced happened, as he said, a few days later, or maybe it was on another trip to Japan. I like that. He's not sure which of those two it is, but he was invited to another Buddhist service. This time it was an early morning service in Kyoto. At the end of this one, which was also long, he said, they opened the doors of the temple and you heard the sounds coming in from outside. These two experiences informed the idea of a lengthy all-night performance, ending with the opening of the doors at dawn as the final part begins, so that the sounds would come in, as Cage says, so that the sounds would come in because, you see, it was a transition from literature to music, and my notion of music has always been ambient sound anyway, silence. So I want to show, in the same way that I showed the page from Miro, I want to show a couple of pages from Empty Words to see how those are different. And also in particular, something that I forgot to mention is that in Empty Words, there's the 4 different sections, and over the course of the entire performance, each of the 4 sections gradually eliminates more and more of the types of language that are included. So the first one begins with phrases, words, syllables, and letters from Thoreau's journal. And then the second lecture removes phrases. The third lecture removes words, so that there's just syllables and letters left. And then the last lecture is only letters, just individual letters from Thoreau's journals. So let's see, I'm going to share screen again. Sharing. Okay, so this is the first page of lecture 1 from Empty Words. You can see that formally it's constructed quite differently from Miro, even though most of the techniques and in many ways the source material is the same. I should have pulled this up earlier so that you could kind of look at it while I was talking, but I'm going to have to move on kind of quickly. But I want to show you also, I want to kind of skip ahead to the beginning of lecture 4 to see the way, to get some sense of how that transition occurs, at least on the page. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's parts from lecture 4, the last one, which is just letters. Okay, and that puts us at I'm at 12 minutes now. I'm going to take just one more minute because what I would really like to do is let you hear a little bit of what, get some idea of what this sounds like, because that's kind of the significant aspect, is once this sort of like fragmenting and reassembling, this kind of collaging process, which happens very much on the page. What's kind of interesting, where the interest starts to happen for me in particular, is this idea of how does a human now actually engage with this and think about how to make sound out of it. And there's a great recording of Cage reading Miro from the 70s. I'm going to play just like a minute of it to close things out, and then we'll open up to questions from there. Okay, so sharing screen one last time, sharing computer sound. Ooh, and hopefully everyone can hear this. Please let me know immediately if you can't.
Sparrow sit, a grosbeak, betrays itself by that peculiar squeaker-y effect of slightest tinkling measures. Soundness, ing plisa, we hear. Does it not rather hear us? When he hears the telegraph, he thinks those bugs have issued forth. The owl touches the stops, wakes reverberations, de Gualchi. In verse, there is no inherent music. Iovsa takes a man to make a room silent. It takes to make a room. It is a young appetite. And the appetite, for is he oasis sea morning, you hear scream of great hawka, idk, body she lie, being silence. It would be noblest to sing with the wind, to hear a neighbor singing.
Okay, that's as good a place as any to stop it. I'll just my final word on this. I want to close out with a quote from Robert Ashley, the composer, who also did a lot of work with language in a quite different way. This is from a talk that Robert Ashley gave in 2000. He said, "All of us, I believe, are thrilled to listen to a foreign language when we have no obligation to respond. Foreign language overheard is heard as music in a way that we can never hear the language we speak." And I really see what Cage is doing here with these particular works as attempting to get at some way of being able to do what Robert Ashley is saying we can't do with our own language, finding a way to fragment by sort of disrupting the syntactical pathways of the language. It disrupts our ability to get meaning from it and forces us to suddenly start to listen to it in particular ways. So, okay, yeah, that's my presentation, the very quick gloss on the research. I'd love to hear any questions anybody has for the next couple of minutes.
If I can ask a question.
Yes, please.
I guess I hadn't known, I don't know why I hadn't known about the backstory of the experiences that he had in Japan.
Oh, yeah.
So this is obviously for me making it, giving it an even more interesting and compelling angle. But I guess I'm really interested in, like, it seems like I'm thinking about the first pieces of yours that I heard when you came to Wesleyan, and I feel like I've seen kind of a trajectory of the type of things you're working on now. I'm just interested in, like, based on this final MA, like, experience of writing the thesis and performing empty words, like what kind of things you're excited to work on in the near future, like what sort of ideas it's brought to the forefront.
Yeah. I think, you know, I came to this work because I also have been interested in language and you know, I'm a singer, and I've done a lot of both singing and composing for voice, and obviously the question of, like, text and what relationship that language has to the music is kind of a particular is a particular question that comes up. So I became really kind of interested in the way that Cage was thinking about this stuff of the language actually being the music and finding ways to do that. But I guess, yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer succinctly, obviously, of course. But I think like what I will say is that my particular concerns right now are about thinking about this and thinking about song, the idea of song and singing, you know, in context of folk music and context of all kinds of other things as well. But yeah, I think like that's where my head's at a little bit, is finding ways to think about like, how are these ideas that Cage is expressing here, how can they be useful to us right now in the kind of music that we or I or anyone is making right now, and thinking about ways to take it. Is it useful outside of the context of a particularly kind of like classical music context of a concert hall, you know, where you might expect to hear Cage performing this when he would have been performing these things? Are there ways to find uses for this in other kinds of musics outside of that? Sorry, that's sort of like my off the cuff answer to that. I think it would be easier to answer if I could, you know, play some music for you and really we could have a longer conversation. But yeah, I hope that answers it at least partially.
We definitely will have more to talk about.
Oh, yeah, Marvin.
Hey, Stuart, thank you. How you doing? Wonderful
Good.
job. And sorry I missed your performance last week, but I think I don't think I have a specific question, but just maybe an observation to get your feedback. And you were talking about the connection to military and war, and I was thinking about two things. First of all, the defragmentation. You know, when you think of, you know, the beginning of war and then what war does, defragments everything, but also the thinking of sound and silence as one and put in a temporal context, you know, as far as the length of the work, to be able to feel the implications of the importance of that silence, to rethink, to recontextualize, you know, what is speech, what is text, what is sound, what is music. And you were talking about putting it more in the concert hall typical, which is based on, you know, some type of controlled timing. But in your, you know, work moving forward, or, you know, in the work that you've done here, you know, what has made the most impression on you in that sense of sound, silence, and time? And, you know, how would you move forward with that thought?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of Cage's particular concerns is, you know, is this idea of trying. I think, you know, particularly in the later half of, I mean, from the 50s on, I would say very explicitly, he's trying to think about making music in such a way that that hopefully people can have an experience with it that causes them to listen and pay attention to things outside of the experience that they just had in that sort of controlled time, like what you're talking about in the concert hall. The idea that like you come out of that and are listening to other things differently now. And I think this is, I don't know if this is really answering your question very well, but this is one of the things that I think is particularly kind of interesting about this work, and this work in particular is attending a performance like this or giving a performance like this. I think, like in my experience, once you've left that experience, language is, I am suddenly listening to language differently. I'm listening to people speak differently. or and this is, like in that quote that Cage gave, where he's talking about the silences and the ambient sounds coming in from Don, and saying this is his idea of what music is like space for the sounds around us. And yeah, anyway, that's the best answer I know how to give in the amount of time that we have right now. But I'd love to have a longer conversation with you about that as well, Marvin.
Thank you, and congratulations.
Thanks
to all of you.
I think that's about all the time we have for questions for my presentation. So we're gonna move over next to, actually, I don't have the schedule pulled up. Does anyone remember who? Oh, here we go.
I think I'm up next.
Devanney's up next.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, Stuart, just wanted to draw your attention to a comment from Stephen Nordstrom in the chat. And not a question per se, but at least no question marks, but a comment for you.
Yes. Oh, thanks. Yeah. Stephen. Thanks for being here, Stephen. By the way, I think that you're here because of Garrett, but I don't know if you recognize me, but we know each other from a few years ago. It's nice to see you here.
It's a very small world.
Oh, that is kind of strange, isn't it? Back in St. Mary's in the day. Oh man. Stuart, by the way, is a great book list, everybody. Like, great. So anyway.
I really like your comment. I'm just going to read out loud really quickly for everybody in case people aren't seeing it. Stephen said, I'm struck by this idea. Liturgy seems to do the same thing Cage was doing in creating the same musical, mystical space for that opens the heart to be receptive where a native language speech might not be able to convey. I really agree with this. And obviously Cage's concerns are very mystical and spiritual as well. And especially, I didn't mention this, but a couple of people alluded to this. I did do an all-night performance of Empty Words a couple of weeks ago, and my experience with that was incredibly. It felt very liturgical, and especially by the end of it, it was for me a very profound performance and kind of spiritual experience. Yeah. Okay. Let's move over to Devanney for her presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Stuart and Garrett, and thanks in advance too to Briele, who will be up next. One thing that is just so exciting about listening to all these presentations is the connections between them. So some things that'll come up, like the importance of instruments and like the meaning that instruments have, or connections to John Cage also. Just one thing that I feel like we haven't really totally connected with this semester is just like discussing our work over the course of the school year. So it's really cool to like see what kind of threads there are, even just kind of developing on their own. So I'm just going to give like a short overview of my project, share some photos, talk about them, share a couple quotes. Because yeah, time is brief, unfortunately. So I wrote my thesis on piano destruction. So looking at several works of art where pianos were intentionally destroyed or used for musical purposes, and partially destroyed upon entering these pieces or destroyed in the process. So I was very interested in looking at what kind of opportunities does destruction afford, rather than just, or beyond just the kind of the loss of the instrument or the breaking down of this instrument. What kind of like symbolic opportunities are there? What kind of personal, emotional opportunities, performance opportunities? What does the breaking down of this material, also the breaking down of the symbol of the piano, what does that afford to performance and to music, and to art as well? These pieces kind of bridge the art world with the music world. So I'm going to share my screen here. see how I can do this. Okay, can everyone see these images? I'm gonna try to make it a little bigger.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. So actually we should go to the beginning. The first piece I looked at is a piece called Piano Activities. This was a piece, the score that you see in this image here was written by an artist, Philip Korner, in 1962, and was performed in Wiesbaden, Germany at a festival in September of 1962. Korner, along with George Maciunas, who was the artist who kind of interpreted this piece for performance, along with many other artists, were part of this kind of amorphous group, but also kind of aesthetic art movement at the time called Fluxus. They were known for kind of very avant-garde works, very radical performances. And one of them, Piano Activities, was particularly dramatic in that a piano was destroyed on stage over the course of several performances. So it might be a little bit hard to read here, but the general idea of the piece, or at least the score, as it was initially written, was actually an influence from John Cage, Cage's Prepared Pianos. And Korner kind of took this idea of manipulating the piano as like a sound object rather than playing it traditionally. He instructs for bringing in found objects to interact with the piano, scratching or rubbing the strings, playing around with the pedals to explore the piano as like a sound maker beyond just the mechanism of hammer hitting the string. And so this sounds kind of like a very innocent idea of a performance, somewhat radical, but in actual performance, what we have are an actual destruction of this grand piano. And so a couple of things that I look at in this performance are why do this, and why a piano in particular, something that was that emerged out of Fluxus, and like the ideas, the goal of Fluxus was this dismantling of the art institution. And this, I think, comes out of Maciunas's goals. So it is kind of a Fluxus aesthetic, but Maciunas wrote this manifesto that calls for like purging and fusing and what was the other verb? Basically like dismantling institutional art and transforming it to kind of bring in ideas and objects from the everyday and make art kind of an everyday happening. So in terms of destruction, this is a very kind of overt, like symbolic gesture of the actual dismantling of art institutions, dismantling of the piano. But at the same time, also is like a very radical interpretation of Philip Korner's score, in that it does use the piano as a new kind of sound object, destroying it in this case. So I look at the performance like taking the lid off, allowing multiple people to interact with it. You have various ways of sounding the instrument. Also, Maciunas's role in interpreting this piece. In interviews from the performers, they say they never saw the score. All they had was instruction from Maciunas. So this was very clearly like his interpretation. And then I also look at the reception, which is somewhat visible in this image here. You can see how people are responding. And there is kind of a mix. Some people, in recordings too, there's laughter from the audience. There's some confused glances. This was also broadcast on television, and this upset a lot of people. And again, it comes through the piano as a symbol, not only as a symbol of institutional art, but also a familiar symbol, an instrument that is kind of ubiquitous and very familiar and personal for a lot of people. So this did cause a lot of upset, people getting very horrified with this performance. This is possibly the most violent and radical of the three performances, or the three art pieces that I'm looking at. But we'll just move on to the next one. Again, another instance of piano destruction. Here, more architectural, but also performative. This is a piece called Piano Bell that was built at Burning Man, which is kind of a counterculture music art festival that takes place in the Black Rock Desert in Nevada every year. Now, Burning Man is, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people. At the time, it was only a couple thousand. This was in 1996, in its 10th year. So at the time, bringing pianos into the desert was very unexpected. And again, the same kind of idea of taking the piano out of its familiar environment from stages or in homes and bringing it out, first of all, outdoors, but also into the middle of the desert. And you actually, I just noticed this from this image, but you can see what they call the man, which is the wooden structure of a man that they actually burn at the end. This kind of gives you a sense of scale. The desert, very flat, so something, and also just very spread out too. So something this large that just kind of appears in the middle of the desert was pretty surprising, and kind of like made a big impression on a lot of people. For this research, I interviewed several participants who were at Burning Man at this particular year, and they all expressed the same kind of awe at this installation. In terms of the things that destruction affords in this case, these are pianos that survived or were damaged in a warehouse fire. The artist Steve Heck kind of bolted them together and set up the structure. So they were already partially damaged coming in. The playing that they endured was pretty destructive. But one thing that I focus on in this chapter is things that Piano Bell offers that participants wouldn't normally get to experience with pianos, like hitting them with sticks, or climbing on top of them, or in this case, maybe coming through this doorway, climbing underneath them. So these as destroyed instruments, or instruments that this was an instance where, or an environment where it was okay to participate in destruction. A lot of the participants expressed that they felt very freed by this, maybe having been told not to like bang on pianos in the past, or having frustrating piano lessons. They had the opportunity to kind of freely engage with these pianos in their kind of jungle gym assemblage, however they wanted to. So this was a very cathartic experience for a lot of people. There are so many other things I could talk about, but I will move on to the next and last example. And this is the ruined pianos of Ross Bollider. Bollider is an Australian composer, improviser, also influenced by John Cage's prepared pianos. For these instruments, you can see these instruments here have had their front panels removed. These are some of the nicer ruined pianos, but the idea of a ruined piano is that it's an instruments that, these are instruments that have been maybe abandoned, or families getting rid of their piano because they don't want to take care of it anymore, or if it's falling apart, and it's kind of beyond repair. It's beyond the point that someone feels like it's worth maintaining or keeping up. So Ballader kind of adopts these instruments. He has a piano sanctuary set up, and I'll show you a couple of photos from that in a second. And he performs on them. So he calls these instruments pianos prepared by nature, in a reference to Cage's prepared pianos. And here out kind of in the grass, in the lake, out in this piano sanctuary, these pianos kind of integrate themselves with nature. So destruction affords different sounds from the instrument. The keyboards, for example, if you press a key, it might respond or it might stick, and depending on the weather, depending on the day, that response might be different, or it will be different every time. And so they become these like unpredictable instruments. And then in this next set of pictures, you can just see the ruined pianos in their various environments. And over time, the decay breaks them down, and they change, their sound changes. Ballader has also opened up this sanctuary to visitors. So again, visitors have opportunities to engage with these instruments in locations that they normally wouldn't find a piano. And also when they are more open and there's more access to strings, either from the top or from the backside, it also allows for kind of like a communal gathering and communal performance around a single instrument. So I believe I'm close on time here, but this is kind of a very basic overview of all these instruments. I'm just wondering if maybe I'll also read a quote. I'll just close with a quote from Ballader about the ruined pianos and about how he talks about his performance on them. So he says, "How you improvise will vary from piano to piano and is dictated to an extent by the condition of the piano. A ruined piano can be played in the conventional way, but may also be played seated on the ground." And he says this is his preferred position, but depends on the instrument. So he also says, "This gives easy access to the strings as well as to the keys. It's good to remember that plucking the bass strings on an ancient weathered piano whose soundboard is cracked wide open can produce astonishing pitch bends, then cataclysmic shuddering. Being seated on the ground can also be a convenient position for playing multiple ruined pianos, because the strings of the various pianos can then be played simultaneously, creating intoxicating effects, especially when the sustaining pedals of the assorted pianos are jammed down with erasers." Ballader is also very poetic in his descriptions and his writing, but and I do think his poetry and his music are very closely linked. But I guess I'll end there and open up for questions.
Thanks, Devanney. I think we'll have about 5 minutes for questions that anybody has.
I have a random question.
What's your random question?
Yeah, congratulations first, the three of you. Very interesting listening to you. So my question about the pianos, it's so interesting. I was wondering how did you choose this topic?
That's a good question. How did I come across this topic? It actually started when I was talking to a bass player. I was playing in an ensemble in Wesleyan, the new music ensemble, actually with Stuart. And the bass player was talking about how he was doing this particular technique and it was actually damaging the instrument. But he was saying, it's okay because this instrument is, somewhat inexpensive. It's maybe his practice instrument, or he was saying, but if I would never do this on an instrument that was more expensive. And so I just started, this was kind of the seed. I just started thinking about, when is it okay to damage instruments and when is it not okay? And what kind of emotional reactions do we have when we talk about or when we see or experience instrument destruction. So that kind of led on to a path of piano destruction. And pianos, at least from my research, pianos tend to be the most like intentionally destroyed instrument for artistic purposes. And I think that it is because there is such like a very strong symbolism and like meaning and familiarity of the piano. So it's kind of interesting to see. Yeah, I think like the reactions of and rationale for people, I think was like the initial inspiration for getting into this.
Thank you. Yeah, this topic and also empty words, both they made me like, I don't know, change the way I see or I understand music or instruments. It makes me like, I don't know, open my mind, and it's liberating at some point. Makes me anxious, like what, destroying the pianos or saying empty words, but certainly it's also making me like, I don't know, feel good and think also how this can connect with people's way of processing things or ideas in their mind, that sometimes they're this way and they can also be many ways. So thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thanks, Paula. I see that Jay has a question.
Again, yes, and congratulations to you, Stuart, on yours also. I really enjoyed that on the cage piece. And
thanks,
Devanney, thank you. What do you think of that photo of in the ruined pianos in the lake or in the swamp and in the field? What's the relationship between instruments, whether piano or not, and post-industrial junk?
That's a good question, because I think the reason, at least the reason that Ballader has access to so many of these pianos is because there were so many manufactured, and people there does seem to be like an excess of pianos that either head to the dump or people are trying to get rid of. People give away pianos for free now. So there was, and that was like from a period where pianos were manufactured in such high numbers. I am very interested in like how we also understand trash, because these pianos, like if they were not repurposed for these art pieces, they would have just become trash. Like they would have gotten thrown away. And right, another interesting thing is that I think these pieces are justified because they are trash. Like it would be a very different piece if Fluxus had like sawed up a brand new Steinway. In terms of junk, one question that did come up actually at my defense that I would love to explore further is like, how does Ballader see these instruments as just kind of being like left to decompose on the land, instead of like maybe being properly disposed of. So I think, yeah, there are still more things to explore in terms of like what happens to these pianos afterwards. Like at Burning Man, for example, the whole structure is burned at the end, but then what happens afterwards with that waste? Where does it go? What kind of environmental impact does that have? I'm not sure if I'm completely answering your question.
No, that's
exactly these are things I'm thinking about.
That's
yeah.
exactly where I was going with the question, in terms of as someone who, in my job at Wesleyan over the years, I've had to dispose of several pianos, and I spoke of I had tremendous guilt and bad feelings about it, and spoke of having to send those pianos. I wish I could help send them, ensure that they would go to piano heaven, and maybe that area was the piano heaven. But I don't think that the pianos that I had to dispose of made it to that heavenly environment, and they were actually treated as post-industrial junk. And the idea of yes, even in piano heaven out in the desert, you burn it up, and what are the environmental impacts? You know, your presentation opens the door to many relevant questions of what gets a pass as helpful to society and what is toxic. So again, at some other point, we can continue that discussion.
Yeah, I would love to hear more from you about that.
It makes, if I can jump in just very briefly, it does make me think about, you know, Devanney, the way that you talk about, particularly the first two examples with both Fluxus and Burning Man, there's a difference in nuance about what they're both doing, but both of those actions are kind of aimed specifically at taking the piano, which is a thing, and turning it into junk, or causing a violence to it in the aim of some kind of catharsis. Whereas then with the third example, it's more of a sort of creative act of kind of taking these things that have turned into junk and having to actually look at it as a thing instead of being defective, looking at it as a thing with its own qualities and seeing how can I make this not junk? And then what, you know, Jay, with what you're talking about, is making me think about like this other avenue of just sort of like the more mundane of just like, what about just people who just have to dispose of things and how that's another interesting avenue to the whole question, I think as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually, Stuart, I'm going to disagree with you on that because because I think that all three of these do take the piano and make something new about. There is the transformation of the piano in everyone. So like for the Fluxus piece, they are like destroying it, but in the act, it's not just like you know, tossing it off a building or something or bringing it directly to the dump. Well, there were actually Fluxus pieces where they would do piano drops, but the interest was like the sonic, you know, the sonic exploration. And because they're very, there was like in one video, they're very deliberate about their actions and like, you know, scraping the strings and hacking it, even though they are breaking it into pieces. And same with the Burning Man. It would be one thing to just bring a piano or bring all 88 pianos out into the desert and just burn them, but Steve Heck turned them into a sculpture and people were playing it as a different kind of instrument. So I think one thing that I didn't really get to go into, but these in destroying the piano, kind of like you're changing the piano's instrumentality. It kind of becomes a different instrument. Maybe that's most clear in Ballader because it's a longer time scale. And these examples go from like shortest destruction to the longest. But it is more than just like pure like junking of the piano, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and we should have a longer conversation about it.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you.
I totally hear what you're saying, and I appreciate that you clarifying that that distinction. Yeah.
I'd also love to hear what the cage connections too, what you think of that. But
yeah, I think there's interesting connections in just in the idea of like signs, the idea of just like the semiotic qualities of both what Cage is doing with language and the idea of like the semiotic quality of like the piano that's going on here and pulling it apart. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. I wanted to also draw attention to a comment in the chat from Bobby Griffin. All new instruments kind of settle. All new instruments kind of settle into themselves and their musicians. The strings, reeds, mechanisms, etc., all settle into the instrument's character. So it's interesting to consider what can be done with them after they've kind of crossed that line. I just wanted to draw attention to that. We are kind of over time, but we got to move on. But I wanted to say that out loud for everybody.
Thanks. Thank you.
And can I just say that whatever we agree about the conclusions or disagree or whatever, piano destruction is a fantastic, fantastic phrase for a title. Just congratulations also on that because it's amazing.
Thanks, Garrett.
Okay, thanks, Devanney, and everyone for your questions and engagement. We're going to move over to our final presentation for today from Briele Scott.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my presentation?
Yep, looks good.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say congratulations to my fellow classmates. It's a pleasure to remember how we started and some of the ideas that we had, and just to see how things have developed over the last 2 years. So congratulations to everyone. My piece, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm from the Caribbean, and a lot of people haven't necessarily documented a lot of the developments, at least not a lot of the new developments happening within our culture. So I wanted to take this opportunity to contribute in some way, shape, or form, seeing that the steel pan manufacturing industry has been developing over time. And quite frankly, over the last couple of months, things have been unfolding pretty much in present day as I was doing this thesis. I actually had interviews like right before my defense, like this new information coming, you know, just every single day. So the title of my thesis is A Journey Towards Standardization, Preserving the Art of Building and Tuning the Steelpan in Trinidad and Tobago. However, I only focused on Trinidad, seeing that I did my entire ethnography virtually, and that in itself was difficult. So the steelpan was invented in the late 1930s, and it's one of the most unique instruments of its kind, started from recycled oil tins, biscuit pans, and developed into this unique 12-tone acoustic instrument that is capable of playing any genre of music, classical, anything. And I really wanted to focus on the people who are actually making the instrument, because a lot of emphasis is always placed on the performers of the instrument, without regarding the people who actually have to spend the time to build the instrument. And in my travels, people have spoken about these people and say that they are uneducated, lower class citizens. And although some of them didn't have an engineering degree, they literally learned just by trial, by experimentation, how to create this instrument. And they have taught people around the world. And that's why there are Steelpan factories in Japan and Trinidad and Europe, because of these practitioners. So I wanted to dedicate this to them and show some developments happening over time. Again, as I said, you can make these instruments in a factory. You have to make it with your hands. And then within the last couple of years, Steelpan builders and tuners, the ones who build the instrument and tune the instrument, that I refer to as Steelpan engineers, because it is a science, they have been dying. And just last year, we lost 4 of our innovators. So I felt like it was very, very important to sort of document, just some of the issues facing, what is happening between each generation, especially since the older generation, they came up with this instrument, and they came up with such a unique instrument. And a lot of these older generations were afraid to teach the younger generation, because they thought that the younger generation would take their job opportunity, without understanding that they need to teach the younger generation in order to preserve this art form. So I think the generation today realized that. So a lot of things are happening in terms of passing on that knowledge. So I also deal with that, and then some issues as it pertains to standardization. I also focus on that. So these are some of the innovators that we lost last year. He died in February of last year. He invented a bore pan. He has holes around each note, which allows the pan to resonate better. He won a Guinness Book record for the largest steel pan to date. and he died, I think, later in the year. And he invented a surface protection for the pan. I showed some stages of the manufacturing manufacturing the Steelpan, but I didn't go into this because there are many people who have written about the science of it. And I wasn't really focused on that. I wanted to hear from the actual technicians, just in terms of what challenges that they encounter, you know, in terms of choosing the right raw material and different stages within the manufacturing industry. And then just to give people some sort of insight, the tenor pan, double seconds pan is equivalent to like the first, second violin and viola. But this is, I can't get into this because I don't have a lot of time. So in regards to standardization, there have been many issues faced in terms of the layout of the instrument. There are many different variations. In terms of the shape that you make the instrument, every single tuner, you know, had their own unique style. However, because the Steelpan is becoming such a global, you know, because again, it's a global entity, the fact that Steelpan is being used to teach music education, we need to standardize the layout of the instrument so that I can travel anywhere around the world and it's the same layout. However, I really didn't want to focus so much on this, seeing that a lot of other scholars and researchers have touched on this somewhat. I wanted to focus on standardization as it pertains to the raw material, the beginning stages of the material, especially since the instrument was made out of all drums. And people have been experimenting, trying to find other materials to manufacture the instrument. They have tried stainless steel. However, as it pertains to some of the experiments, they realized that although the stainless steel is mild steel and it's a little bit more, it's stronger. However, it will take way too much effort to be able to secure those notes. After you tune the instrument, the instrument needed more, I should say, upkeep. So some people have turned to sheet metal, where they buy the actual sheet and cover, and they sort of construct a barrel, and then they go through the different stages of the manufacturing. And this has been a huge issue as it pertains to getting raw material. Trinidad and Tobago, we have natural oil and gas, but a lot of our factories have, at least they sold it to other international companies, and we don't have an actual factory that produces drums specifically for the manufacturing of the Steelpan. And that was one of the issues that I wanted to focus on. And as a result, some of the manufacturers started using toxic barrels. They didn't necessarily know. They thought that, okay, we could clean this out, we could, you know, burn it, all these different things, and then maybe this could be something that we could use. However, people started to link the sudden death of some Steelpan manufacturers to their exposure to these toxic barrels, and that became a huge issue. One thing I also wanted to, but I dealt with in terms of standardization, was the fact that there's still a lot of secrecy happening within the industry. And that's why standardization is such a huge problem. Every tuner, every builder is sourcing drums internationally with different composition of the steel. And I'm saying that we need to come together and actually decide, okay, we need drums for pan that has X amount of carbon, X amount of iron. Like we need to come up with some sort of ingredient or you know, just to because I felt like if everybody's using the exact same steel drum to manufacture the instrument, that in itself could improve the final sonority of the instrument, the quality of sound in the final stages, especially when you have to temper the instrument during the burning process. If you are operating and you're using drums with different compositions, then you have to burn those drums at different, you have to burn it for a different period of time. And to me, I felt like we needed a little bit more of a standardization. Well, we need to sort of standardize the process of manufacturing the drums. So we have double-sided drums by Steelpan. Some people source drums from Chicago. The guy who founded this, he just passed away actually like last week. Unfortunately, she made recipes. And Tobago, which is the governing body of Pan in Trinidad and Tobago, they started manufacturing drums from a machine that was given to them by the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago. However, the machine has been under repair, so there were some issues as it pertains to this. So they had advertised, we have drums on sale. However, when tuners went to purchase drums, they realized that there was a problem in terms of the construction of the drum itself, and that they didn't even have enough material to meet the needs, the supply and demand of the builders and tuners. However, that happened in August. Just in May, they actually got a new shipment, and a lot of this had to do with the pandemic, being able to source these raw materials during this period of time. And some people also complained about having to pay money, carry large sums of money to pay for these steel drums. So when I spoke to the Tobago representative in the process of doing this research, they said that they were going to, rectify those issues, and they actually did. So there has been some sort of development in terms of getting material to manufacture drums for purchase, and the way in which the method used to purchase these drums. Unfortunately, in January, the chrome factory burnt down, and the chrome factory is part of, is used to secure the steel. So the industry faced this new situation where they had to figure out exactly how they were going to proceed. Chrome is the best way to, they call it the finish product to secure and wrap the instrument. This chrome factory had a long relationship with the Steelpan community, and they it helps in terms of the presentation, and when you chrome the instrument, it lasts 20 plus years. Another thing that people use to help to protect the steel, because if you don't put some sort of protection, it could rust, etc., was painting the instrument and powder coating the instrument. So as the chrome factory burnt down, more people started marketing these powder coated instruments. Another aspect as it pertains to preserving the art of building and tuning is trying to figure out what programs are put in place to actually teach these students. Because again, it takes such a long time to tune, to learn how to tune, to hone your skills. Because you can learn within a couple months, a year, but then it really takes practice for you to be able to develop an ear, and it's an art. So you have to practice. So the Pan in Schools Coordinating Council in the secondary schools started teaching MIC and UTT. These are some sort of like tertiary level programs. However, after they graduate from these programs, there's nowhere for the students to go. So this is another issue that is faced. If these students graduate and there's nowhere for them to go to actually practice and develop themselves as builders and tuners, then people tend to find other occupation. And that's one of the issues that, that the industry faces right now. In this entire project, I interviewed the surviving builders and tuners and separated them from the second, third, fourth generation. This is as an example of some of the people that I did. And I was focusing, because I have to do with virtually, I focused on Steelpan engineers, builders and tuners who had their own independent manufacturing workshop, and some of the efforts that they were making to brand and market their own business. Within the future of Pan, you see that there's the gap is sort of strengthened between the older and younger generation. On the picture, this picture right here is a picture of Lloyd Gay, who is one of the 3 surviving master tuners. He's almost 77, and his son, who is in his 40s. So in this aspect, you see the older generation passing on this skill to his son. And he is really trying to market and brand the instrument in a way that his father couldn't. Another thing is that you see, I'm not too sure if you can make out this, but the instrument is made by one person, by Juma Jackson. However, the instrument is tuned in terms of the harmonics and octave, getting, you know, the tuning aspect of it by another person. So people they're sort of dividing the manufacturing process, where one person is just focusing on building that instrument, and then the other person tunes the instrument. Whereas at the beginning of the manufacturing industry, a builder, a Steelpan engineer did everything. He built and tuned everything. So now there's, you know, specializing in terms of, you know, getting, and I guess this has to do with the supply and demand of the instrument. You have people that are teaming up. So the younger generation are coming together to work more. And then in terms of marketing, this is a powder coated instrument that that he had been experimenting with to try to appeal, seeing that we don't have a factory to chrome the instrument, and people tend to gravitate towards obviously the chrome. It fits, you know, metal on metal type of thing. People are finding new ways to market and brand the instrument, having logos. This is something that didn't exist within the last few decades. People are also engraving the instruments and having designs on it. This is another way to appeal to consumers. I just want to go quickly. And one of the aspects in which I hope to make a contribution is the fact that we don't actually have a chronological list of the evolution of the Steelpan and a list of all of the builders and tuners starting from 1926 to present day. So I have been collecting information on the builders and tuners, separating them from generations, second generation, first generation, second generation, third generation, and the, you know, last generation. The youngest person is was born in 1993. And most of the first generation tuners have died, with the exception of Mr. Anthony Williams, who is going to turn 90 in August. So I felt it was very important to pay homage to these individuals. However, at the time that I sent in my thesis, I had 70 something names that still needed to be included on the list. And I couldn't add them because there's no record of when they were born, when they died, and all of this. So this is something that I'm going to continue over the summer. And I'm hoping to put this up onto a website. And the one method of me getting this information is actually speaking to the, we call them the Steelpan's men and women who grew up with them and would know this information. So I have to be a little bit more direct. And I wasn't able to, however, I did manage to secure a substantial amount of people to add on this list. Another thing I did was list some of the manufacturing workshops and have their information in terms of contact information, when they started the company. All of this is something that, you know, doesn't exist. That is also very necessary. And the pan sticks, that the pan sticks would belong to the mallet family. So, you know, the tool you use to actually play the instrument. A lot of young people are getting into making these pan sticks and experimenting with different types of wood, rubber, etc. So I listed those companies, adding their contact information and Facebook, Instagram accounts for anybody who, you know, wants to learn about it. Yeah, I'm going to end just because it's too many things to cover in such a short time. I'm sorry if I was speaking very quickly. I know I have an accent, but I hope I'm able to understand everything. Yes. Any questions or anything?
Yeah, we can take a couple of minutes for questions. I have one question, Briele. I'm curious, you know, in the move towards standardization of the manufacturing of the instruments, I think, you know, you make really clear the kinds of the benefits that are afforded through that. I'm curious what you see as any of the things that are lost through that kind of standardization, or if any.
That's a great question. I think what helped to develop the builders and tuners was the fact that they had to work on different types of drums, and every single drum posed different challenges. So they were able to work with that metal and come up with a very high quality instrument. And many people believe that that is what separates our builders and tuners from from everybody else around the world, because most tuners that, you know, have developed internationally, they have access to resources. So they could only work on a particular type of drum. So if they have to work on a drum that, let's say their problems to sync the drum at a particular, you know, degree or whatever, it causes challenges for them. However, these were some of the issues that our builders and tuners had to deal with on such a regular basis that it actually developed their skill at a higher level. And every single builder and tuner had their own unique sound, because again, they have their own technique in terms of what they want to hear in terms of the tuning process. So you can literally listen to one band, and if one person was responsible for making that instrument and tuning that instrument, the quality of sound is completely distinct to another band. So if everything is standardized, then you sort of kind of lose that originality. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic to me. Yeah, I think it's very complicated.
It's a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, of course. Marvin, I see you have a question.
All right, thank you. Hey, great job, Briele. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to seeing, you know, your further research and offering. I have a couple questions. It'll probably be three layered into one. The first is, you mentioned you talked about the builders and tuners, you know, and the legacies, and then you talked about manufacturing. And I wanted to see what were, you know, their connection to the manufacturers. Like, did they have a, you know, what was their spot within that whole system? You know, and I'm getting down to, you know, thinking about, you know, the revenue of, you know, standardizing, you know, and you think about Trinidad and Tobago, and did you have any type of number? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Did you have any type
I'm
of
sorry,
number?
you were cutting up a bit, just.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, and I was wondering if you had any type of numbers of, like, you know, the revenue, and then if there was one manufacturer that was generating more based on a certain builder and tuner, and standardizing that because that generated, you know, more revenue per se.
There's a lot of issues as it pertains to that. So at the beginning, there was one main manufacturing company called Panland, and they had these builders and tuners working under them to supply instruments abroad, to, you know, because again, a lot of schools started developing Steelpan in their programs and stuff like that. However, as these builders and tuners learned the business of manufacturing, they started to branch off and have their own independent manufacturing businesses. So again, and then there was another guy who came up and he started Steelpan. So essentially there are two main manufacturing industries. And then within the last couple of months, a friend of mine, he is soon to launch his own manufacturing industry at the end of the year. And because the chrome factory burnt down and he's getting sponsored by Hadco, by an industrial company, they are actually going to work on providing that service. So, you know, people are concerned when it comes to the competition, and you know, so that's one sort of socio, you know, political dynamic that people are sort of, you know, grappling with. And the fact that, you know, there are a lot of secrets happening, because I don't want to tell you too many things, because you could use this information and then you will have a better clientele. So just even getting numbers was something that I couldn't get, because if I put this in my paper and people see, that could cause, you know, issues. And when it comes to the component of the steel, I'm like, okay, like you are getting pans from Chicago. What is the makeup of that raw material? Nobody wants to kind of let you know, because, you know, so there's a lot of little issues that that carry us further and further away from standardization. However, in the younger generation, the fourth generation, they are coming together and they are communicating, and they are, you know, sharing ideas and sharing a lot of knowledge amongst themselves, because they realize that what the older generation were doing wasn't necessarily carrying them anywhere. So they are trying to do things differently. And with Midco, he's a young person getting into this. He's also trying to do things differently. So there is some sort of, development as it pertains to that. I hope that answered your question.
It does. And I had one more question that tags on to the material. And, you know,
Marvin,
knowing a little.
Sorry, just in the interest of time, because we're already kind of over, but I see that Jay has a question. I hate to cut you off, but
you cut me off for Jay? No, I'm just kidding. I understand.
Come on,
I'm just kidding. No, I understand. I'm just joking. But, Great job, Briele.
You know, maybe we'll let you ask a question, then we can continue conversation after things are kind of formally ended. Okay,
you got it.
Sorry about that. I have to be sort of the taskmaster.
Got it.
Oh, Jay, you're muted. Jay, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, because my question would probably require an extended answer also. Marvin can go ahead and ask his question. I'll ask Briele this later. Okay. But just to say, excellent. and I'm hoping that Marvin's question will have something to do with how you engineered being an indigenous practitioner and then writing this paper in the objectivity and objective language of your experience in studying ethnomusicology. I'm sure that that's part of what Marvin's question was. And if not, we'll withdraw that and let Marvin ask it.
No, that's exactly what my question was, Jay. Thanks for asking it for me.
I think that it works well to be an insider because I have been playing pan for almost 20 years and I've been teaching Steelpan, all around the world. But the thing is, I am not an actual builder and tuner. And usually because it takes a lot of concentration, tuners will usually come at night when everybody is away from home. So they're usually sort of, kept away. And for me, I wanted to sort of give them a voice and to sort of hear from them some of the issues that they were facing. So a big part of my thesis was actually doing interviews, which was very difficult because the older generation, they don't have social media, and just getting in touch with them, and so many people around the world source them out to get information about how you tuning this and how you get, and usually they feel like people are just coming to them for information. They feel kind of used, and a lot of them were sort of hesitant to speak with me. However, when I told them that, we rely on you. Without you all, I have nothing. I have no career. We actually need the practitioners. And that's why we need to sort of preserve this art so that, we could be able to sustain this art form in the future. And I told them exactly what I was doing. They opened up, their arms to me and they welcomed me to speak with them again. So that's why it is important for me to continue building on what I was doing in terms of adding on the list of builders and tuners throughout the generation, and putting it up on a website, because it's not just for my paper. This is something that is absolutely necessary, and I feel like this is the least I could do, seeing that I was able to build a career out of playing and teaching the Steelpan. So again, of course, I'm Trinidadian, so I could obviously understand and communicate, with them. We speak English. Of course, it's just a way, a gesture and a style that we have in Trinidad. So that wasn't a problem. But, some older generation of the builders and tuners, there was a little bit of, they were a little bit guarded at first. And then they quickly opened up. And some of the younger generation, again, they're very open. And most of them, I went to school with some of them that became builders and tuners. So it was very easy to get onto them and to get that information. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but yeah.
Yes, that's good, Briele. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for having me. And it was a pleasure to be able to sort of share in a nutshell all the work that we did. Thank you, Devanney and Garrett and Stuart. And I missed that we didn't get to hear from the others, but I'm proud of all of us.
Yeah, and thanks, Devanney, for organizing this, really taking that on, and spearheading it.
Well, this of course wouldn't happen without all of you. Also, a quick shout out to, and they're not here right now, but Aaliyah and Webb are other two graduating MAs this semester. And also to Grant, who's still continuing, but also is in our year. It would be great to hear from them. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it, but just a congrats to them as well. But thank you everyone for coming. I think, Stuart, you mentioned maybe we could just keep this open a little longer if other people have lingering questions, but of course, feel free to head out if you have other things to get to.
Yep, we'll declare it officially ended.
Thank you.